Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've got one last question, gentlemen. I appreciate, again, you sticking around. I've heard, again, across the entire panel today, a consistent message about corporate tax reform. Dr. Zandi, I think you used the word comprehensive. You also mentioned the role of smaller-sized manufacturers. Mr. Timmons, I'll put this to you. How critical is it when we sit and talk about corporate tax reform here that it goes just beyond the C corporation level and moves down to the S corporation level?
Well, thank you for asking that question, because it is critical. 72% of manufacturers file as S corporations or other pass-through entities. So when there's discussion to raise individual rates at the end of 2012, that will have a huge and direct and negative impact on manufacturers. The corporate tax rate is clearly a competitive disadvantage for us right now, but raising individual rates would be a severe competitive disadvantage for us as well.
Dr. Zandi, you have the same position?
Yes, in the sense that I also think we need to have comprehensive reform of the personal income tax code as well, and all of these issues need to be considered in a broader context.
And that's the reason I asked the question is that it seems up here that we have two debates. We have a debate about corporate tax reform, and then we have a separate debate about individual tax reform. And the message that I'm trying to get out, and I'm hoping you gentlemen agree with, is that there's an area in between. And it's with the S corporations that is really, it's a corporation in terms of what it does, but it gets taxed as an individual. So what I'm hoping that we can do here, Mr. Chairman, is have an understanding that corporate tax reform includes small businesses and S corporations.
Yeah, and I think it is important, the way I kind of think about it, cutting across businesses and individuals, is looking at the tax expenditures in the tax code, the credits and deductions in the code that make it very complex, reduces its efficacy, and just creates bad incentives. And the strategy should be to scale back or eliminate as best we can so that we can raise more revenue, but also lower marginal rates, and then we accomplish everything that we need to.
Congressman, I'd just add that the notion of a corporate tax where a small large corporation and a large small corporation face completely different tax systems is completely illogical. The high tax rate for many individuals who are many business owners is a distortion. It's a distortion that's taxing and discouraging both the supply of labor as well as the supply of capital. I'd also note, however, that addressing these issues separately, while not ideal, doesn't disadvantage our smaller businesses. The customers of our small businesses are often large businesses. And so while we should work to both reduce the individual marginal rates to help S-corps, partnerships, and sole proprietors, the advantages of a corporate tax reform are good unto themselves.
Mr. Mulvaney, I don't want to be the skunk at the garden party here, but I have a slightly different perspective.
Sure, that's what we're looking for. So.
I do think that we need to look at the effective corporate tax rates among manufacturers. They vary widely. They vary from about 0% to somewhere in the mid-20s to, in some cases, a little higher. I don't think I'm burdened by economics training in saying that I do believe that targeted tax assistance can be effective. For instance, in industries that we're attempting to incubate, you often need public incentives to have those industries thrive. The Clean Energy Manufacturing Tax Credit, which Senator Stabenow mentioned, had a great deal of uptake and really helped to establish battery facilities, wind turbine, solar panel. I think that we should encourage other energy and development too, including nuclear. But the point is that for the sake of an elegant economic corporate tax system, we would make a lot of sacrifices. I do think it makes sense to target tax relief for manufacturers that are actually making things in the United States instead of overall income. And the last thing that I would add very briefly is I think it misses the larger debate, which is virtually every other country we're competing against has a value-added tax system that has rebates for its exporters. The United States, almost exclusively among industrialized countries, does not have a system like that. And I'm not saying that we need to adopt a system precisely like that, but it does put our exporters at somewhat of a competitive disadvantage.
Mr. Paul, that brings us back full circle to where I started, though, which is that every time you sit and you give the example of a successful government policy on encouraging a particular industry, there's 4 or 5 that have failed miserably. And my fear is that we sit here and we are actually practicing what you've preached. We are giving tremendous incentives to various green energy segments. And my fear is that we are siphoning capital and simply siphoning creativity away from what actually might be working. We're sitting here today, for example, encouraging wind. My concern is that by doing so, we're drawing resources away from something that might be more productive than wind energy. So, again, that's part of the overall debate. But I think to your first point regarding the effective tax rate, I think that's exactly what Dr. Zandi was getting at, which is that because of all the loopholes, because of all the incentives, because of all the subsidies in the tax code itself, that you end up with small companies paying a much higher rate than large companies, and you end up with some industries paying much higher rates than other industries. And I think what Dr. Zandi and some folks like myself have been encouraging is a system that simply does away with that. So the effective rate is actually the actual rate at the same time. So,
can I just make one quick point?
At Chairman's discretion, because I'm out of time. So
sorry.
Can we make that in a moment only because we want to keep moving?
No, well, that's fine.
Congressman, thank you very much.
I can speak 3 days or 3 minutes.
Senator Stabenow, or Senator Klobuchar. We had Senator